Hi, everyone, and welcome to Innovative Strategies for Data and Assessments. My name is Ryan Heschler. I will be the presenter and moderator today. And just a couple of housekeeping things and technical aspects of today's presentation. So first of all, please check the audio setting on your computer as well as your speaker settings if you're having any audio trouble. If you're still having issues, you can see our detailed audio troubleshooting file, which is available in the resource list under the Q&A window. If the console freezes or you hear music after the presentation has begun, please refresh your browser. There's some other icons that open additional features in our webinar console. You can read about today's speakers, click the resource list to download a copy of today's slides and other resources, or join the group chat. Follow the conversation about today's webinar on Twitter using the hashtag EWWebinar. We welcome your questions. Please type them in the Q&A box, accessible through the tabs located on your console and not in the group chat. Finally, an on-demand archive of today's presentation will be available online in the next 24 hours. Both the archive and a free-to-download version of the slides will be accessible through edweek.org or using the same login as you used today. So with that, we're going to get started. So my name is Ryan Heschler. I am on the Edulastic team. I work on curriculum and instruction. And our topic today around innovative strategies for data and assessments, I wanted to start with the questions of why assessment and why now. And I think one of the things that is I am really excited about in my role is I get to talk to district and schools all around the country. And one of the things that's come up is the idea of how to successfully implement assessment at scale and what that might look like, especially on the formative level, is kind of being revisited right now. And there's a couple of things that I've noticed as I talk to folks around the country around assessment and what that looks like in schools. The first has been spoke about ad nauseum, and that's this idea of the effects of the pandemic on student assessment results. And we see data from large-scale assessments like NAEP or state summatives that show that there was significant learning loss for students. But one of the things is that it doesn't often provide, the nature of those assessments is more to capture a snapshot of student performance, and it doesn't always provide actionable data to chart a path forward for students. Because of that, we've seen that there's been a push to incorporate embedded assessment. As a matter of fact, the US DOE, as part of their recommended ESSER funding, considers embedded assessment an encouraging use of ESSER funds. A third piece that we're seeing emerge right now in the discussion around assessment, and this I think is really interesting, is the idea of sort of the user experience. Teachers and administrators over the last couple of years were exposed to a wide variety of adoptions or adaptations that we had to make. And one of those was being exposed to a variety of new tools that are available for assessment. And I think I am really encouraged by the conversations that I'm hearing from educators around the country around how can we make this more accessible to folks so that there's not a high barrier to entry to be able to really do meaningful assessment in schools that helps move students forward. And finally, this is all sort of continuing sort of a longer term trend away or towards assessment that is more frequent, more actionable, versatile, and standards aligned. So with that sort of frame of reference, I want to talk about our agenda for today. And we're going to start by jumping into some of the research around specifically formative assessment, and then go into the challenge of what that looks like and why it's a challenge to sometimes implement consistent formative assessment and scale. I want to talk about strategies for successful data and assessment cycles. And then we're going to open it up to a panel. I have some wonderful educators here with me today that I'm really excited to have them speak with you all. And then finally, give the opportunity to see how Edulastic could fit as a part of a successful formative assessment system. So you've heard me mention this a couple of times already, formative assessment. Why am I focusing on that? Why are we talking about that today? It's not the only component of a balanced assessment system. When schools are looking for insight on student performance, we look at things like state summatives, universal screeners, diagnostic assessments, reading literacy, dyslexia screeners, things like that. But often formative assessment doesn't receive as much attention or structure at a systemic level. By nature, it's flexible. It's used by teachers on a daily, weekly, monthly basis in the classroom. But it doesn't often have the same supports and structures built around it that you might see with something like a large-scale state summative or a universal screener. And it's unfortunate because the research shows, and sort of the seminal research on this is from Black and William, but there's also studies, we'll look at the Clute study as well, that formative assessment is often the most effective at improving student learning. It is the closest to the point of delivery, and it gives teachers the most actionable insights into student performance. But without some of the structure, you see sort of a broad range of what formative assessment could look like from classroom to classroom or teacher to teacher, or even district to district. And I think there's some interesting trends happening around sort of merging these two types of sort of summative assessment being high level and maybe sometimes disconnected from what students learn on a day-to-day basis, and formative, which is very connected. And there's really three things that have stood out to me over the last year or so that really drove this point home. One is I get to read Natalie Wexler's fantastic book, The Knowledge Gap, and she talks about this idea that often, because of the way that students have been assessed on sort of these high stakes, summative level assessments, we've tended to focus on how do we build skills, and sometimes disconnected skills in students. For example, the idea that if you teach a student how to find the main idea of a passage, they could apply that to really any passage that they read. But the problem is we don't always see the data bear that out. Students are successful in some areas and they struggle in other areas. And she talks a lot about this idea that that is directly connected to the knowledge that they have accessible to them or what they're learning, rather than the skill that they might have or might be assessed on. And there's been some recent innovations around large-scale assessment that are connected to this concept. One is happening in Louisiana. They have an innovative state assessment where they're actually aligning their state summative, and this is in trial right now, to the specific curriculum that students are accessing. So when they take that summative at the end of the year, it's actually on the content, not just the standards that were covered for the year, but the content that they focused on. And so some really interesting things to watch here. We also see some states considering this idea of through-year assessments. So giving multiple assessments over the course of the year that would be considered taking the place of a summative. And so there's this sort of merging of the idea of like gathering quality, authentic data in a way that's structured, as well as being dynamic and connecting to what students learn in the classroom. But coming back to the challenge, we see that there's a broad range of what could be considered formative assessment. It ranges from things like I learned today statements or 3, 2, 1 at the end of a class, all the way up to an interim assessment, which some districts could consider formative, where you have many different questions on many different standards, and they tend to be a little more systematized, and then everything in between. So I want to root us in the research. Why are we talking specifically about how formative assessment can help be an innovative strategy for data and improving student outcomes in schools? And there's been decades of research that looks at the effectiveness of formative assessment. And I think one of the things that you hear, I get the chance to go to conferences and speak to state departments of ed, as well as teachers in the classroom, and kind of across the board, I hear that we know that formative assessment is one of the most impactful forms of measuring student progress. But it's not, again, always, it's not always as focused on in a systemic way. And in the original sort of seminal study on formative assessment with Black and William, they talk about this idea of a black box, that what happens in the classroom is sort of, it sort of disappears from the rest of the school system. And the formative assessment, when implemented properly, we know can really lead to dramatic outcome increases for students. the Clute study that I have up on the screen now looked at sort of a series of formative assessment studies. It was a meta-analysis of the existing literature. And it found a number of interesting conclusions, one of which was that overall formative assessment had a positive impact on student achievement. So classrooms that delivered formative assessment strategies saw increases on some of those larger scale summative assessments that were given later. And the second piece is that across all of the subject areas, formative assessment had a larger effect on student achievement when it was either directed by either a teacher or something like a computer program that allowed for a more objective view of what the student was learning and what they wasn't. And this is contrasted with things like today I learned statements or reflections. And that's not to say that those aren't important. I use those in my classroom. They were a great tool into understanding my students better and their metacognition and knowledge of what they were learning. But the research seems to show that in order to effectively have formative assessment, we need to structure it. And you know, the two options that were presented in this study, either teacher directed or computer directed, there are advantages and disadvantages to both. So we're going to look a little more about what some of the conditions might be that are a challenge. And I think one of the challenges around something being teacher directed is that teachers have minimal time. Anyone who has worked in a school, anyone who has served as a teacher knows that you're often balancing many, many, many different things. And teachers now are asked to do more than ever before. And a big piece of effective formative assessment is having the time to access high quality materials, create quality questions, analyze the data, and often collaborate with colleagues. And that time is not always there in schools currently. A second challenging condition is the fact that traditional teacher prep doesn't always dive into the skills for the creation of a quality assessment. I remember when I started teaching, every Thursday night writing my test that I was going to give the next day. And of course, I was writing it the night before instead of before I taught the lessons. So it wasn't a true accurate reflection of what I had. And I would think about the questions that I would want to ask. And I know I asked some low rigor questions, things like, what was the main character's best friend's name in chapter 2? Something that probably wasn't on the level that my students needed or that was going to give me effective data into their performance. And that was because I didn't have the training, and I developed that over the course of my career. But there are things we can do to help support educators in that process. We also know that educators sort of across the board often miss the mark on identifying grade level rigor. If you've read The Opportunity Gap by TNTP, data shows that students often spend up to 500 hours per year on assignments that are not at grade level. That's almost 6 months of a school year. And if we can help by providing high quality materials, the current push for high quality instructional materials has gotten a lot of attention over the last couple of years. But it's also true in assessment. If we can provide materials so that folks aren't needing to create their own and figure out, does this meet the level of rigor I need to see? Do I need to increase it or decrease that level of complexity? We can make that task a lot easier. Finally, just the logistics of scaling assessment on an ongoing basis can be a challenge. You're reading responses, you're scoring, for teachers that have 25, 30, maybe even 35 students in a class, multiple classes a day, it becomes sort of an overwhelming task to say, you need to look at every single one of those responses, score them, and figure out what the most appropriate next step is for students. So as I thought about a framework for today's discussion around assessment, I came back to a fantastic book, Driven by Data by Paul Van Brix-Saintoyo. If you are looking for ways to really practically improve a data-driven culture within schools, please check out his book. And he also has an excellent book called Leverage Leadership. But he talks about a assessment framework that's really composed of 4 things. We need to assess students. We need to analyze that data. We need to act on it. And then finally, we need to build the culture. And it sounds straightforward, but often it's hard to get all of these pieces working together. Sometimes we're really good at assessing. Yes, we all gave a common assessment. Everyone in our school, our grade level teams are giving the same assessment. But then we don't have the time to analyze it, or we don't have the time in our pacing guide to go back and reteach when students misunderstood. So we're assessing, but we're not actually seeing any actionable outcomes for students or any improvements because we haven't taken the time to take that assessment and use it in a meaningful way. And I love this quote. He talks about measuring outcomes is only useful if you know what the target should be. If the target is different in each classroom, then we have no way of knowing how students are doing across a cohort relative to each other. They're stuck with varying degrees of rigor depending on which teacher they have, and that's not fair to our students. It's also not fair to educators to expect the monumental task of implementing a successful ongoing assessment system to just fall to an individual and to have to come up with all of those materials, all of the framework for analyzing and acting on that data without the support of a culture that's driven around data-driven instruction. So as we've spoken with educators around the country and incorporated best practices around assessment, there's really sort of 6 things that have emerged as practical considerations. If we're looking to really create a data and assessment-driven culture, one is to make sure that there's access to high-quality items and content. That's curriculum, but that's also assessment. That's questions, that's distractors, and that's tools that can be used to move student learning forward after you've assessed as well. The second piece is it needs to be easy to use. And this is one of the biggest barriers to a lot of assessment is it either requires too much of a heavy lift of creation on the part of teachers or administrators, or you have a platform or part of a curriculum that maybe is a little clunky or doesn't work the way that makes it easy to have a data-driven culture. A third consideration is there's got to be a variety of ways to assess student learning. Just asking multiple choice questions or just asking thumbs up, thumbs down questions, it's not going to give a robust picture of where students are at. The fourth piece is actionable data. It's one thing to see that students got something wrong or right. It's a totally other thing to be able to see that, identify where the gap was, figure out what the misconception was, and decide how you're going to reteach to move student understanding forward. We also want to make sure that we're involving students. And data bears this out, that in classrooms where students are heavily involved in formative assessment, and they understand why they're being assessed and why they go back and redo something that maybe they think they were already taught, it shows that students build a different attitude around the work that they're doing. And then finally, there needs to be opportunities for professional development and collaboration. How do we make sure that educators can work together to build something together and to really have those productive conversations around taking students to the next level? So I wanted to quickly, before we go into our panel discussion, just share sort of the experience of what our approach to assessment was at my previous district. This was by no means perfect, and this was something that we labored over for years to build a structure for. But we eventually built a sort of a hybrid model of both formative classroom level as well as a district-wide instruction that we felt got us to a point where we were having productive conversations around students. It ranged from interim assessments that were given 3 times a year that were built off of our state blueprint and standards, to common unit and mid-unit assessments, as well as common quizzes that were given about every 5 lessons or so. And then teachers designed daily exit tickets to their pacing guide to sort of try and hit those targets of those 5-lesson common quizzes or the common unit and assessments. It took a lot of structure to create an environment where we actually felt like we were moving student outcomes forward, we had to have a common assessment platform for that. Our district did use Edulastic as a way of incorporating assessments at all levels of our structure in order to get that instant data analysis and be able to take action on it. We also had to build in times for looking at the data, for reteaching, and some common planning time for teachers to really meet together and brainstorm. So there's no perfect solution for how you build a data-driven culture, and it might look different depending on the needs and the goals of a particular school or classroom or district. But I am really excited to be able to bring some educators from various districts around the country to share their experience of what innovative assessment looks like and means to them. And so I have a few panelists who are joining me today. I see Mackie and Tyler. We also have Randy with us. So gentlemen, thanks for joining. I really appreciate you being here. And I would love if we could each just take a second to introduce yourselves and sort of why you're here and your approach to assessment in your particular role. We'll start with Tyler. Tyler, I know it's a spirit day at school, so you got your purple on. But Tyler, if you could go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Tyler Brown. I'm a sixth grade English teacher from upstate New York. I'm really happy to be here today to kind of share the way that I've used assessment in the classroom, especially through the use of Edulastic, and really have a conversation about how can we engage our students in assessment the way that we engage them in the classroom with the way that we teach. Because really when it comes down to it, that's what we should be doing. And it's really important that we recognize that we need to meet our students where they are, whether it be their ability level or even just the way in which we teach them. We should assess them the same way. So I'm excited to be here with Randy and Mackie and Ryan and really have this conversation and kind of let it play out as we go. So thank you.
Thank you, Tyler. Randy.
Sure. So I'm also from upstate New York, not quite as far as upstate as Tyler is, but near Albany. I've been in education for about 20 years, taught fourth grade for 12 years, taught fifth grade, and my current role is a math interventionist for grades 3 through 6. So I'm pulling kids every day, small groups, delivering instruction for students who are struggling in math. And my journey of assessment started back in about 2017 with my first experience using Edulastic. And it was just kind of eye-opening because a lot of what I thought was, as Ryan was mentioning, was some good assessment practice, really wasn't that good. And so as I learned to be better at writing questions and better at assessing and writing lessons with the end in mind, so to speak, so that the assessment was the target. As I've said, that when we give a student a target, they'll hit it every time. If we just let them know what it is, and we'll lead them to that. So I'm looking forward to chatting as well and coming from a slightly different angle in the elementary level as well as the intervention level, where assessment is something I look at literally every day. As I said before, I open my email and then I open Edulastic to see what quizzes and tests students are working on that day or worked on the previous day to see where I'm targeting my practice or my intervention that day.
Great. Thank you, Randy.
Sure.
And Mackie.
Yeah, my name's Mackie Pendergrast, and I'm a subject matter expert with GoGuardian. I just retired about 1.5 years ago as a superintendent of schools here in northern New Jersey. I was a superintendent for a decade. And before that, I was a director of staff development for 6 years. And before that, I taught for 15 years. So along that 30 plus year career, there's a lot of different angles and approaches to assessment. And I certainly think about it as a superintendent from a systems approach and how to kind of move a whole district forward, which is always a challenge, of course. So again, thrilled to be here and taking part in the conversation.
Great. Thank you all. I want to start with, I'm going to go back to the slide. We talked about sort of some practical considerations for assessment. And I want to acknowledge, I saw a comment in the chat that formative assessment, it doesn't necessarily mean that it happens every day. And that's a really great point. It doesn't have to be something that is an exit ticket. You know, that's not happening at the end of every single class. Formative assessment has lots of different meanings, and I think the person in the chat said it best, is it allows you to get to a granular level of what are students understanding and what they're not. And so when we're thinking about some practical considerations, was there anything on this list that sort of stood out to you as something that was really impactful in your work around having assessment that was effective for improving student outcomes?
For me, the actionable data, identifying gaps in understanding is a big part of what I do every day, and looking at, with math specifically, where students' last point of success is. Because for me to be able to help them, I can't start with the lowest level and work my way up. I don't have time to do that. So I start at a higher level and work my way back until I find that last point of success for a student. So identifying those gaps is huge, and also just knowing the trajectory of, specifically in math, where things are connected back to and where they're connected next in the next grade level is a huge piece for me. And just doing that support of kind of running a dual track of reteaching concepts that a student might be working on in their classroom, as well as filling a gap to get them to that grade level content in their classroom.
Randy, can I ask you to just, before we go on to the other participants, you said something, it was mentioned earlier, you talked about reteaching. I think, to me, reteaching is such a critical part of assessment because without it, you're just looking at a bunch of numbers. So can you talk to me about what does that look like? Like, what does that mean? How do you take a student assessment and then what do you do with it?
Well, any of the assessments that students are working on, whether it's a topic level quiz or a mid or end of module assessment, I'm looking at the standard, but I'm also looking at the skills that underpin that standard. So within math, obviously you have skills that support a standard, and many standards in New York State have multiple domains within that really, support that standard. And so just as an example, when you talk about like the properties of mathematics, whether it's the distributive property, associative property, all those things, that's one standard. And so I need to know exactly which part of that standard I'm working on. And I think one of my strengths really is that reteaching component is like, okay, this student didn't understand it the way their teacher taught it in their classroom. How can I present this a different way? Whether it's, and sometimes it's for a fifth grader, even getting out manipulatives or drawing pictures, because they're just not getting it in the abstract. And for a lot of students, that concrete representational trajectory, and it's not, as I say, it's not linear. It's, the wash, rinse, repeat. If I get to the abstract and they're still not getting it, we go back to the concrete materials. So that's a big part of reteaching for me is just kind of knowing what materials I have, and I have a lot of them, to be able to target those, whether it's, like I said, chips or counters or whatever it happens to be for a student.
Great. Thanks so much, Randy.
Sure. Welcome.
Tyler, anything that sort of stood out to you from looking at this?
I mean, it kind of goes back to what I started with before. Number 3, where it says variety of ways to assess student learning, item types. This summer, I really took a step back to think about the way that I teach, the way that I practice, and the way that I assess. What does my plan look like? What does my roadmap look like? And I use a lot of different ways of teaching in my classroom that isn't necessarily your standard, read a passage, answer multiple choice questions, read a passage, answer multiple choice questions. With English, we've got such a wide array that we can assess knowledge in a variety of ways. It doesn't have to always be written expression or multiple choice. And I thought to myself, if I'm educating and teaching my students in the classroom, I'm engaging them in the content in ways that are not multiple choice or written response. Why would I assess them in that way? Why would I assess them in a way that's different than the way that I teach them? So by reflecting back and thinking to myself, what does that look like? It's allowed for me to create assessments, both formative and summative, that it's keeping my students on a playing field that's not changing parameters and variables. It's a very level playing field on assessing their knowledge, because I'm not trying to trick them. I'm not saying, we're going to do this. We're walking around the room and we do this carousel activity and we see all of these things and make these observations. And then, okay, here's an article, read it and answer some questions. Those don't correlate in my mind. I haven't seen any data to support that it does, especially with my change in assessment. And that's where Edulastic really came into play for me, is there are so many question types built within Edulastic that I can then support and assess my teaching in ways that are different because I have the options of the different question types. And by engaging them in that manner, they're more successful when they complete an assessment because they're able to use the same parts of their brain and be in the same mindset when they're answering those questions.
Yeah, I love what you talked about. If I'm teaching in a way, why would I assess them in a different way? And I think that versatility and flexibility in assessment, you talked about the item types. Like, it's really powerful to be able to say, I still want to give something that's standard aligned, that's structured, but isn't necessarily just read a cold passage and answer some questions. And I also love that you talked about ELA. You and I bonded over the fact that we were ELA teachers. And I think a lot of people have this conception that assessment or data-driven instruction is a math thing. It can only happen in math. And I think that is just, it's not true. It takes a different level of effort, but I love that you talked about that as well. So, Mackie, I want to turn it over to you.
Yeah, and for me, they all jump out, but certainly professional development is so important. I think if you look at education today, schools today, you get all the different types of teachers, right? You have teachers teaching the same subject. Maybe they've taught it for 20 years, some teachers for 2 years, some just a couple of months. You have so many different types of teachers, and what is their understanding of assessment? It's so critical. There's so many different. When I look back over a 30-year career, I think about how many professional development sessions or faculty meetings or department meetings were dedicated to, here's what we believe about assessment. Probably not enough. And so the more we can support teachers in understanding what we all mean by assessment as a department or as a school, the better off the kids are going to be. They're going to benefit from that. I think one of the struggles for children is there's so many different ways that they are being assessed from different teachers. So that also, I think, hurts learning because it's not as focused. So I would also kind of go back also to involving the students in the assessment conversation. And it goes back to everything that was said before, Rainey and Tyler, just whether it's reteaching or other parts of assessment, the more voice they have about what they're learning and how they're proving that they've learned it, the stronger and the greater efficacy they're going to have in their learning, better sense of control that they can get there from where they are. So those two things really jump out at me.
Great. Thanks, Mackie. Mackie, I'm going to come back to you first with this question, but I'd like to ask all of our panelists this. We're talking about assessment, very generally. We're talking about it in classrooms, or we're talking about it in districts, things like that. I wonder if from each of your perspectives, and I think through our conversations, it's clear that your experience has shown that regardless of whether you're looking at the classroom level or the district level, you've all sort of zoomed in on an effective approach to assessment. And so could you kind of talk about, like, what does that look like from a logistical standpoint? What are you doing to make sure that, it's not just something you get to occasionally, or something that some people are doing or some kids are doing in your class? Like, how do you create a system of effective assessment from your perspective? And Mackie, I would love to start with you on this question.
Yeah, it's such a great question. In terms of how do you take for me, a systems approach so that assessment is being done properly. And I think that's exactly it. If assessment is kind of one-off, here you have a one-day PD and now go do it, then as a district, you're probably going to be in trouble, right? So you have to build a whole system around those effective practices. So beyond professional development, you have to make sure there's also those are ongoing sustainable conversations that are taking place in department meetings and faculty meetings, but also in your supervision and evaluation process, so that when you're going in to observe a teacher and you're having a conference, a post-conference afterwards, you're having, of course, conversations about the instruction and the curriculum, but also about assessment. So you have to just tie all those things together. It can never be a one-off, but you have to build it into the entire system.
Randy and Tyler, what does that look like from your perspective? Like when you're regularly assessing your students and acting on it, what is that cycle like?
I really like what Mackie said. It's not a one-off situation ever. That doesn't give you, and you said it a bunch of times, it doesn't give you actionable data to actually use to move yourself forward. It's really a circle when you think about it, like if I'm using a shape, because it's a process that you should constantly be going through, whether it's daily, it's weekly. It should be something that, number one, reflective teaching should be your first tool when it comes to designing assessment, right? You should be able to reflect back on what was it that you taught, how did you teach it, and was it successful, when then developing that assessment. And I think reflecting back on the assessments that you give to see the results is also going to help in that process as well. I know for me, what I like to do is really narrow in on a few standards. I think too often we try to hit every standard or too many standards when doing assessment. And you might have one question on each standard, but it may not be enough to really get a good picture of where that student is. So for me, what I do is I narrow into a few standards that I really want to hit. What are those standards that I'm focused on the most? And then what I'll do is I'll design that assessment around those standards to match what we're doing in class. I make sure to have multiple questions on each standard. So if a kid, has struggles with one question, but does really well with the other three, it's probably the question that's the issue. It's not their understanding of the standard. If I notice that there's one throughout a couple of weeks that seems to have the most issue, then it's like what Randy said. It's all about the reteaching, right? So we teach, we practice, we assess, we reteach, and it's kind of that circle of going in there. But I think the word reflect needs to be put in there too, because as long as I'm reflecting before I reteach, it's really going to help me narrow in even further what I should be doing, right? So I guess to sum that up, it's find those specific standards, create assessment that matches my instruction that's going to assess those standards, give that assessment, reflect on my assessment that I gave, were the questions fair, I get the results I was looking for, and then reteach those specific things and involve the students in that. With the live dashboard, I can show the class without the names, right? That's fantastic. I can hide the names. We can have that discussion. We can see where those red and green marks are and say, look, we struggled here. Why did we struggle here? Let's talk about that question together and then move on from that.
Great. Thanks, Tyler.
I'm thinking of a lot of different things as each person is talking. I'm kind of jumping around trying to make some notes to myself. But, one of the things that I tried to do when we came back after the closures in the, late winter, early spring of March or of 20, is when we reopened our school in the fall, is like we needed to hit the ground running with priority standards, right? We really dug deep into what is the main priority work of this grade level. In my role is in math specifically, but obviously other teachers were doing that in other content areas, because we didn't necessarily have time to dig into everything. And we needed to make sure we were, like before I said, we're filling gaps as well as getting kids to grade level. And, I know that a lot of experiences varied as far as remote instruction and just all the different models that came out of that. Some were great, some were not so great. I think the biggest challenge I'm still facing within my district is really just getting everybody, as Mackie said, to have that one day of PD, and then everybody just kind of goes back to their silos. How do you get people back into the main area to have a conversation around data, around learning? And it's a challenge because people kind of have their mindset of like, this is the right way, or I've always done it this way. As my brother, the engineer, says, that's the worst reason to keep doing that. It's a challenge. And so people are stuck in their ways at times. was something else that I heard that I'm not sure if I'm getting to it, but I know it. As far as assessment design, I just had a third grade teacher today. I was looking at the math quiz that she was giving, and this one question, the very first question on the assessment, a lot of kids were not getting it. They were just bombing it. And I said, I wonder if you would put that question later on in the assessment. If you didn't put that as the first one, like right out of the gate, this really hard question, they just kind of went like, these are third graders, they're 7, 8 years old. So that assessment design piece is a really huge thing for me, and especially when you have the volume of questions that you have on a platform like Edulastic, where you can go, okay, that's a good first question, that's not a good first question. And to be able to literally just kind of slide questions up and down, really designing assessment. And honestly, I would give 5 or 6 questions versus a 10 or 15 or 20 question assessment, especially for very young students. I can get a lot from 5 questions. And so that's a huge piece. If I can assess a kid in 15 minutes, then we have time to do some of that reteaching. We have time to do additional practice versus giving them 30 questions and they don't finish. I think some kids just tap out. So there's a lot of things as far as making assessment design and analysis of assessment as a system within a school is often challenging, but I think that's where we need to kind of drive our energy towards.
Yeah, Randy, such an important part about like actually building the assessment in a way that it is manageable and it gives you the data that you want to see. I think though the other thing I'll add, you talked about like being able to reorder questions or filter. One of the things we hear from educators a lot is that idea of being able to search by DOK level. And being able to say, hey, I don't want to give an entire assessment of DOK4 questions or DOK1. Like I want to be able to stagger those questions, so I'm really seeing where the breakdown happens, and to inform my next decisions. Mackie, I'm sorry I cut you off. You were going to say something.
Yeah, I just want to build off both of those comments and back to your original comment. And then there's a question also in the comment section just about time. And 20 years ago, the things we're talking about really would be impossible. When you talk about systemic assessment and moving a whole district forward with assessing in the proper way, the teachers have to have the right tools, period. They just simply don't have enough time. There's far too much on their plate for everything they need to do with their students, no matter what the level, if it's kindergarten, middle school, or high school. And they need the right tools and resources and support and time, and all that goes together. And that includes curriculum resources as well as assessment resources that are easy to use. Teachers absolutely need that. And if they have it, then all those things are possible. And I just want to make sure when we're talking about systems, we have to supply those teachers with the right tools.
Yeah, thank you, Mackie. And actually, you connected on one of the questions I was going to ask next. But I'm just curious, Tyler and Randy, we had a question in the chat just around like how much time is available in a school day to be able to create these assessments when you're being asked to design them, administer, analyze. And I'm wondering if you can just talk a little bit about, how you use Edulastic to sort of streamline that process.
I can't think of a world where I don't have Edulastic to do my assessments anymore. Like, honestly, it was a game changer, specifically when we, the year we reopened in 2021, I was assigned to a 5th grade class, and I had a hybrid class where I had 8 students in my room and 8 students remote from home, and 2 ELL students, and they were there every day. So like what I was designing it as far as assessment, I mean, it was a whole different world that I was like, okay, this is the one thing I have, not the one thing, but one of a few things that I had that could level the playing field between those students at home and the students sitting in front of me. And once you understand and get your head around how Edulastic works, you don't necessarily need to be drafting your own questions. There's a lot of really good stuff out there that whether you tweak them or you take them lock, stock, and barrel, it's quick. I mean, literally, I could put together a 5-10 question quiz with less than 10 minutes and be assigning it in that moment. So as far as time to create something, it's minimal. As far as time to analyze the results, again, with all the insight graphs and things like that, it's minimal. It really is a game changer in terms of I don't have to sit and hand score all these. I don't have to sit and do the own little, what you used to do is the the item analysis of like how many students got this question wrong, and not only how many they got it wrong, but who put A, who put B, who put C, because that matters. So to me, it's such a streamlining tool that I can't imagine a world without it at this point.
Yeah, I mean, Randy kind of answered most of that question. I'll hit on that last part of the question. It says designing instructional adjustments for each student. That's one of the best parts about Edulastic that I found is, number one, each assessment, you get a breakdown of that student, how long is spent on each question, which selection did they pick? Then you get standards aligned to all of those things. But as you give assessments throughout time, with using Edulastic assessments, you can then run multi-assessment reports to see where that student is growing or declining or inclining based off of your instruction, and that's all done for you. Like Randy said, you don't have to run that item analysis for all of those questions. So what I can do is I can select a student, I can hit multi-assessment report, I pick the 4 or 5 assessments that I've given, I hit report. I'm going to have a standards-based assessment for that student that I can then quickly say, all right, great at this standard, struggling here, this is where I'm going to put my focus. Boom, it's done. It's done for me. Obviously, you're going to have the backside of things where you have to design or take questions that have already been made that are standards aligned so that you can get those results. But there's so many great Edulastic certified questions that are already there, and it tells you they're certified. These questions have been checked. It's not like they're just dropped into a bank for anybody to pick and choose from. They're certified. They've been checked. They're great questions to use. So going in that you can kind of abandon that feeling of everything has to be mine. I have to make everything, and use those questions. It's going to reduce your development time and give you more time to focus on your students, because just the information that you get and so quickly is unbelievable, kind of like Randy said.
Thanks, Tyler. And we have a couple of other great questions coming through in the chat. We may not have the time to get to all of them, but I'm going to try and get us through some a little more quickly and ask a few questions. So one came up around reteaching. How much time do you allocate for reteaching, sort of, if you're doing an exit ticket or a short quiz, like the previous concept? I know this is always the balance, right? How do you make sure kids are getting what I already taught, but how do I make sure I have enough time to teach the things that I need to teach? So for Tyler or Randy, if one of you has some ideas around just how do you balance that?
I would say for me, and this is just kind of the way that I look at the way that I teach things, I try to make sure, and like we talked, Ryan, we're a bit more open with English as far as how we're hitting our standards and our skills. They're much broader, I feel like. I try to make sure that when I write a lesson, I've got a clear 1 or 2 standards that I'm trying to hit. But I don't in a sense of where, all right, we hit that one standard, we're moving on to the next standard. So I think part of the reteaching for me is increasing, it's a buzzword, rigor, right? It's a buzzword, but it does make sense. I want to increase the rigor of the understanding of that standard each day I'm teaching a lesson. So my standard might be that might be 1 or 2 standards for that entire week, so that it provides me the opportunity to do that reteaching, right? I'm not worried about having to go to that next standard because my focus is still on that one standard. So I kind of build that reteaching in by increasing the amount of time that I teach a standard before I move on to how I move forward to another standard. So I think by building that into your lesson plan, I know that with math, it's a lot more difficult to do that, because if you can't do A, you can't do B. If you can't do B, you can't do C. But building in that time and thinking objectively about your teaching, how can I start my next lesson that's a continuation of the previous, so that moving forward we know where we're at. So I think sometimes it becomes much less of an assessment question and more of a curriculum design kind of question.
Great. I can't remember who mentioned it, but there was a question in the chat that we sort of touched on. I would love to expand on. What data do you collect about your teaching practices to correlate to student data to see what works? And I think I heard someone say, well, maybe this wasn't the right question. And it's kind of not that the kids didn't get it. It's just maybe I didn't do my portion of it. And I certainly remember reflecting on that a lot. And there's a balance you have to strike, I think. So I would love to hear just, how do you incorporate your own yourself as a variable into your students' data?
I saw that question too, and I was like, I hope we come back to that, because that is something that, we have to recognize that if you give an assessment, whatever type of assessment it is, and students don't do well, none of the students do well, that's no longer a student issue, that's a teaching issue. And we hopefully all recognize that and go, okay, what did I do wrong? What was it that I did that was not getting the message across? And so as far as the teaching practices, one of the things that we've worked on, it not fully implemented, but in the math realm of what's called a math whole school agreement, whereby we're talking about the language we're using. We're talking about, it's a document that has the models that we're using. So if a student moves from grade level to grade level, and one teacher is using, I'm gonna say this once and I'll never say it again, is using the word borrowing when they're talking about subtraction, when we should be talking about decomposition. Students, particularly that I work with, they see that as two very different things. But they don't understand that one teacher uses this word, the other teacher uses this word. They think that's two different concepts. And if we can streamline the practice as well as the vocabulary we're using and the models we're using, and I would say even in the English world, there's vocabulary and things that would be commonalities throughout grade levels, that's just going to save us so much time, because we're not teaching something as a brand new item. And I tell students when we're talking about problem solving is don't treat these problems as a brand new experience every time. What are the patterns here? What's happening here that looks familiar to what we've done elsewhere? So that you have these teaching practices that teachers routinely use grade level to grade level, so that it really does streamline what new things teachers have to implement each year.
Randy, as you were saying that, it made me think about my favorite moment in our sort of journey to be a more data-driven district was when we had our first sort of data day where teachers were bringing their results together and they were talking in a non-punitive way. I remember sitting at the 7th grade math table as teachers from schools all over the district were like, we struggled with this, but you what were you doing differently? I see your kids got, and just like the power of that moment, I remember being so impactful of like when it becomes true formative instruction, like it's meant to inform what you're doing, it becomes such a powerful discussion and tool. And our teaching practices are just as important as students learning as the variable in that. We probably have time for one more, and this is a meaty question, Mackie. I'm going to come to you with this. What would you recommend changing first in a system? And the person who asked the question talked about, do you change the schedule around how educators have access to this? Do you change the resources they have available to them? Do you change them at the same time? And I think from a systems perspective, I'm curious, if you're trying to tackle a change in your assessment system, where do you start?
Yeah, boy, how much time do I have? So I think depends on the school, depends on the issue. But I do think that it goes to the last question. I think you have to start with instruction. To get to assessment, right? I think that you need to make sure that there's an understanding of instruction and the way that you're instructing in those curriculum resources. But I think if that is on the level and that's where you're happy with where that is, I really do think it's critical that to have the kind of conversations that you're talking about, that when you need the system in place where you can get to the data quickly. I think that when you can have meaningful conversations. So for me, all change really gets anchored into, are you having meaningful conversations? And I don't think you can have really meaningful conversations about learning unless you have the really high quality data. So I do think that along with that instruction, if you can get to high quality data where you can start talking about instructional practices and assessment practices and standards in the most authentic and high quality way, then that's where you can get real change. you have to have that high quality data. And I think it needs to be 1 or 2 clicks away so you can have meaningful conversations. But it's those conversations that create change.
Thank you, Mackie. And, you mentioned having access to the data. I saw the last question that popped in is just, in what ways can Edulastic help teachers design assessments? So I want to take we have just a few minutes remaining to kind of highlight what are some of the resources that you have available if you're using Edulastic to help drive assessment. And we talked about a number of these keywords: quality content, reteaching, misconceptions. And so I want to start with just how do you gather your assessment? How do you get it together? And Edulastic, as I think Tyler mentioned, has a high quality certified item bank with tens of thousands of questions aligned to standards that are very easy to filter, add to an assessment, modify to meet needs within a classroom. And you can also create your own questions. I think Tyler also touched on the fact that as an English teacher, he doesn't want to always get through just multiple choice questions. There are over 50 different item types that you can build. Anything from, you see here, like hotspot type questions, drawing responses, sentence responses that allow you to really assess student learning in different ways, but still get a standards-based, data-driven perspective so that you can take that and actually act on it. And I think we heard a couple times about the live class board today as being a tool. I love the live class board. I hear it from teachers over and over. It's one of their favorite things to use in classrooms. You can, in real time, see how students are doing. I can't remember who mentioned it, if it was Tyler or Randy, but one of you talked about the present mode, where you can make students' names anonymous. You can put the data up there, have that conversation without feeling like students are really, going to have their data put out there for everyone to see. And it really starts to build that culture of, this is not something that, is being done to me as a student. I am an active participant in my learning and revisiting that. The insights that you get once an assessment is given are instant. It's automatically scored. You have access to question level analysis, so you can see question by question and standard by standard, how did students do? We talked about the need for addressing not just whether students got it right or wrong, but what answers did they choose? Where did the misconception happen or the understanding breakdown? That response frequency report, it makes that readily available so that you can see, here's the students who kind of went down this pathway of thinking, and now I have a better idea of how I can address their future learning going forward. There's also the ability to overall track progress with students. I think we heard Randy and Tyler mention the multi-assessment report and the ability to see over time, how are students doing? Are they trending in a positive direction? Are they struggling with something? And that might change from unit to unit or week to week, depending on what you're focusing on. And then finally, this piece of letting students in on I heard someone say once, demystifying data, right? Taking some of this, all of the standards, all of the grades, all of the feedback that students get, and making it accessible to them in a way where they can actually, in Edulastic, pull up their own data and say, here's how I'm doing. I did really well on my ratios unit, but geometry I'm struggling with. And that's way different than I'm not good at math, which I heard so many kids say over and over. And so that power of being able to know as a learner where you're succeeding and where you need more help, I think is just incredible. And so with that, I first of all really, really want to thank our panelists, Tyler, Randy, Mackie. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really enjoyed our discussion. To all of our participants, thank you for joining us. If you're interested in learning more about how we can help, please start by taking a look at the deck at which you have access to. But we would love to see if Edulastic can be part of helping you on your assessment journey at your school and district. And thank you again so much for your attention today and your participation.